Kia ora everyone, and welcome back to the IA Max channel. I'm Mohi here. In this video, I'll talk about the Azure Bastion. What is it and how to create one? So let's dive in. Before we start to talk about the what is the Azure Bastion, let's talk a little bit about how we used to connect to our Azure Virtual Machines before using the Azure Bastion. So to do so, to access our virtual machines over the internet, we had to assign each virtual machine a public IP address, and also had to open up the TCP port 3389 for the RDP and TCP port 22 for SSH, depending on what type of remote access we want to use. So this, of course, is not so securely optimal. So we don't want to expose our virtual machines to the internet, and this is where the Azure Bastion actually comes in. The Azure Bastion is basically a PaaS VM. It's a fully managed VM that is securely hardened by Microsoft that lives inside the virtual network where your Azure virtual machines exist. What we are basically doing is that we are using the protocol RDP or the SSH protocol over TLS. Our traffic is encrypted using the TLS, and we are accessing our virtual machines from within the Azure Portal. What happens after that is that the Azure Bastion, being a VM living inside the same VNet, would have direct access to the virtual machines that you have in your VNet, and then you could use whatever protocol, whether it's in RDP or in SSH, to access your machines. Why would we want to use the Azure Bastion? So the first thing that we gained by using Azure Bastion is that we no longer need to expose our virtual machines' public IP addresses. We could actually remove those, and we don't need to open up the RDP and the SSH port, as Azure Bastion is actually accessing those virtual machines using the private IP addresses of those VMs, since the Azure Bastion and the Azure Virtual Machines actually live in the same VNet. We also don't need to install any agent on the Azure Virtual Machines or any software, as it would use the native clients in your operating system as the RDP native client to connect to your virtual machines or SSH. The other thing is that I don't need to secure the Azure Bastion because this has already been done by Microsoft, since it's a fully managed PaaS VM. And then finally, I don't need to securely harden the Azure Virtual Machines here because we are only accessing those using private IP addresses from within the VNet. So these Azure virtual machines are actually not exposed to the internet at all. So the traffic flow actually is that using your personal computer, you would have a public IP address because you want to access the internet, and then the Azure Bastion would also have a public IP address. The connection from your PC to the Azure Bastion is secured using the protocol TLS. It's encrypted using the TLS. Then the traffic from the Azure Bastion toward the Azure Virtual Machines is using the private IP addresses, and then back again from the Azure VM to the Azure Bastion, again using private IP addresses within the VNet. And finally, the Azure Bastion would use the connection back to you over the internet using the Azure Bastion public IP. So what are the use cases for the Azure Bastion? I could use the Azure Bastion to connect to virtual machines that actually live in the same VNet, or I could use the Azure Bastion to connect to virtual machines that live in another VNet that is paired with my current VNet. So in looking at this case, we have a VNet that we call the hub VNet, and then we have other VNets that are called spoke VNets. Those VNets have pairing with the hub VNet. So we have virtual machines that live in the spoke, and those virtual machines with their VNet are paired to the hub VNet. And what happens now is that the Azure Bastion would have a route back to reach those VMs, and it will still use private IP addresses. So we could access virtual machines that live in the same VNet, or we could access virtual machines that live in a VNet that is paired with my current with my current VNet. A recommended design is to build the Azure Bastion in the hub VNet to save having to build another bastion in each VNet. So you just build a one Azure Bastion in the hub and then pair the hub with the spoke VNets. This way you will have one Azure Bastion to manage all the VMs, whether they live in the hub VNet or in the spoke VNet. The one last case that I want to talk about regarding the Azure Bastion, the Azure Bastion can also connect to your on-premises virtual machines. So in this scenario, we have a hub virtual network and those are the spokes. And in here, we have the on-premises network. We've got a VPN connection to our VPN gateway here. And this is a new feature that was added to Azure Bastion, is that now you could use actually Azure Bastion to connect to the VMs that live in your on-premises networks, just as if you are connecting to virtual machines that live on Azure. Now that we are ready and we understand what is the Azure Bastion, let's jump in on Azure Portal and start creating one. So now that we are on the Azure Portal, we will create Azure Bastion two ways. We will create it with a new virtual network, and then we'll add it to an existing virtual network, and we will use it after that to connect to a virtual machine that we have on our VNets. So let's do that. First, let's go to our virtual networks, and let's create a new virtual network. So create. We'll call it, we'll add it to the IMAX resource group, and then we'll call it IMAX VNet 2, and then we'll host it in the Australia East, and in here we'll give it the, we'll use this address space here, and this is the subnet 1. We'll leave it as it is. Next, in here, it's where we create the Azure Bastion. So to add an Azure Bastion to a new virtual machine, under the Bastion host, click on Enable. This will open up the window to fill in the details. So we need to give it a name, so we'll call it IMAX Bastion 1. And then we need to assign it an address space. So let's create it and let's give the Azure Bastion an address space. This is the private IP address that the Azure Bastion will use to connect to our virtual machines that live in the same VNet. So it needs to be from the same address of the VNet. So since we use the 10.0.0/16, we'll use 10.0. Let's say 1.0/26 or 27. So we need to notice here that if we give it a smaller address space, so let's say we pick 28, it's going to complain saying that we need it to be a /27 minimum. So let's give it a /27. And next, we need to give it a public IP address. This is the IP address that you will use to connect to from your browser. So let's create a new one. And let's call it IMAX Bastion 1. And then that's about it. Let's create our virtual network. And let's click Create. Now that our virtual network is ready, let's open up let's go to the resource. And if we click on the subnet, we could see here, we've got two subnets now. We've got the default subnet that we left untouched, but while creating the Azure Bastion, Azure have actually created another subnet and gave it the name of Azure Bastion subnet. This name is very important as Azure will need to use this specific name for any Azure Bastion created here. Now, this is the first method to create the Azure Bastion. The other method, which is the more common one, is how to add the Azure Bastion to an existing VNet. So let's do that. Let's go back to home and let's open up our virtual networks. And in here we have two VNets. The first VNet is an already existing VNet, and the second VNet is the one that we just created. So let's add a new Azure Bastion to the first VNet. To do so, let's go back to home and let's search for the in the search bar for Bastion. And as you could see here, we've got the first Bastion that we created with the second VNet. So let's create another one here, and then let's pick the resource group, give it a name, and pick where we want to host it. And then for tiers, we have the basic tier and the standard tier. The basic tier what doesn't have what is called a instance count. With the standard tier, you have an instance count. This is where you could actually spin up or provision more than one VM to act as the Azure Bastion if you have a heavy load and a lot of work that you would have on your virtual machines, and you are thinking that all this load on one VM is not enough. So you could have more than one instance, and you could change that here. For now, we'll pick the standard tier, and now we'll need to pick the VNet that we want to host the Azure Bastion in. And as you can see here, we have two complaints here. So first, Azure is telling us I don't see any subnet in this VNet that has the name of Azure Bastion subnet, and it is saying the prefix should be at least 26. So let's change that. When we click on Manage Subnets, it will take us to the VNet that we want to host the Azure Bastion in. And we have only one subnet here, so let's create another one. And we need to make sure that it is called Azure Bastion subnet. It must be of a /26 length, and that's about it. So let's save it here, and our subnet is now ready. So let's go back, and as you can see here, Azure has already picked up the new subnet that we created with a /26. And again, we need to give it a public IP address because this is the IP that you will use it to access the Azure Bastion from within your browser. And then let's just create it. And then finally, let's create. So now that our Azure Bastion is ready, let's click on the resource and let's start using the Azure Bastion. To do so, let's go back to home. Let's click on our virtual machines, and we only have one virtual machine here, so let's click on it. And as you can see, we only have a private IP address associated with this VM, and this VM does not have a public IP address. The other thing that I want to show you is that if you go to networking, you could see here that there is no RDP or SSH port open toward this VM using this network security group. So let's connect to it and see if Azure Bastion is going to work. So let's go to under the setting, click on connect, and then click on Bastion, and then from here click use Bastion. And it's now going to ask us to provide the username and the password. So let's do that. And then finally, let's connect. And what's happening here is that Azure has opened up another tab within our browser, and this tab will open up the virtual machine. And as you can see here, we are using our Azure Portal, using our browser that is all secured to access our virtual machine here. I hope you found this video useful, and if you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comments below. And as always, stay strong, kia kaha. See ya.